Have you ever agreed to something simple, something that should have felt nice, and yet the moment you said yes, a quiet little voice inside you whispered, "This isn't going to end well," because that was exactly how it started for me. With a phone pressed to my ear, staring at the calendar on my kitchen wall, listening to my son explain why his wife wanted to treat me to dinner, and even before he finished the sentence, I felt that strange pause in my chest. That soft sigh that comes when you know you're being invited into something that isn't really about you at all. He sounded careful, not excited, not warm, just careful, like he was repeating words he hadn't chosen himself. And when he said the restaurant's name, something tightened in me because it wasn't the kind of place people casually pick. It was the kind of place chosen on purpose, for a reason that usually has nothing to do with kindness. I remember saying, "That's kind of her," and even as the words left my mouth, I felt how borrowed they were, how thin they sounded, ha ha ha. Funny how we lie gently to ourselves just to keep the peace, isn't it? He said she'd gotten a bonus, that she wanted to celebrate, that it would be nice, and there was that word again. Nice, the most overused cover word for discomfort in the world, and still, I said yes because I always do. Because I raised him to believe family shows up, and because part of me, that foolish hopeful part, still wanted to believe this dinner meant something had changed. After the call ended, I stood there for a long moment. The kitchen quiet except for the hum of the fridge, and I told myself not to read into it, not to turn one invitation into a whole story, but stories don't start loudly, they start like this, with a feeling you almost ignore. I thought about how long it had been since they'd asked me anywhere, how often I'd heard about gatherings after they were already over, how many photos I'd seen online where my absence wasn't even noticeable, and I shook my head gently like I could physically shake those thoughts away, sigh, because tonight was supposed to be simple, just dinner, just a table, just family. I decided then that I would go as myself, not dressed up as someone they might approve of, not pretending to be smaller or quieter than I already was, just myself, because I'd spent too many years bending into shapes that made other people comfortable. On the day of the dinner, I moved slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're trying to steady something inside you. I chose clothes that were clean and familiar, nothing flashy, nothing apologetic either, shoes I'd owned for years but kept polished because that's how I was raised, and when I looked at my reflection before leaving, I nodded once, almost like a promise to myself, thinking this is enough even if no one else thought so. The drive there felt longer than usual, my hands resting calmly on the wheel, my mind replaying small moments I couldn't quite place yet, the way my daughter-in-law's smile never reached her eyes, the way my son had learned to look at her before answering questions, like permission lived somewhere between them now. I told myself not to overthink, not to assume, not to prepare for disappointment before it arrived, because hope has a funny way of sneaking back in, even when you've trained yourself to live without it. When I arrived, they were already there, of course, sitting close, leaning toward each other like a private world had already formed, and the greeting was polite, light, almost rushed, a quick kiss on my cheek, a hug that ended before it began. And from that moment on, I felt like I was stepping onto a moving walkway that wasn't slowing down for me. The restaurant itself was quieter than I expected, all low lights and soft voices, the kind of place designed to make you feel watched without anyone actually looking at you. And as we sat, something settled over the table, not tension exactly, but a rhythm I wasn't part of. My daughter-in-law ordered quickly, confidently, adding things without glancing at the prices, smiling tightly after each choice, glancing at my son, who nodded along, silent, and I remember thinking, well, at least they seem happy. Because sometimes that's what mothers tell themselves when they feel pushed just slightly out of frame. I ordered soup, because that's what I wanted, and because somewhere along the way, wanting simple things had become a quiet act of resistance. They talked around me, not unkindly but completely, conversations flowing over my head like I was furniture rather than family, and every now and then I laughed softly at the right moments, the way you do when you don't want anyone to notice you're not really included. I watched my daughter-in-law check her phone between courses, watched my son watch her instead of me, and with each passing minute that small voice inside me grew louder, not panicked, not angry, just clear, saying, "Pay attention." This dinner wasn't about making amends or celebrating anything shared. It was a performance, and I had been cast in a role without being given the script. Halfway through the meal, after another round of ordering that didn't involve me, I felt my chest tighten just enough to make breathing feel crowded, and I realized I needed a moment away from the table, just a minute to gather myself, to reset, to remind myself I was still there, still solid. I excused myself politely, stood and walked toward the restroom, the sounds of the dining room fading behind me, and as I pushed the door open, I remember thinking, okay, just breathe, wash your hands, come back, finish the soup, go home, because sometimes survival looks like small plans. I had no idea that when I stepped back out, nothing would be where I left it, that the table I'd returned to would already be empty, that this quiet, uncomfortable evening was about to turn into something far sharper, something no amount of politeness could smooth over, before I tell you what I saw when I came back, and trust me, you'll want to hear this, ask yourself something first. Have you ever been left behind in a way that was meant to embarrass you, to test how much you'd tolerate in silence? Because what happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate, and it changed how I saw my own kindness forever. Before I tell you what happened when I stepped back into that dining room, I need you to understand something about me first, because what people wear, how they carry themselves, and what they choose not to show often says more than any argument ever could. And that night, every small choice I made became part of a story I didn't yet know I was telling. I've never been the kind of woman who dresses to impress strangers or to compete with anyone else's version of success. I dress to feel like myself, and there's a quiet comfort in that, a steadiness that comes from knowing you don't need approval stitched into your clothes. That evening I chose a simple blouse, clean slacks, shoes I've had for years but still polish out of habit, and when I added lipstick, just one careful swipe, I remember smiling faintly at my reflection, not because I looked special, but because I looked honest, and at my age that matters more than turning heads. I didn't wear anything borrowed, nothing loud, nothing meant to say look at me, because I've learned that the people who really see you don't need help doing it, and the people who don't, well, they never will on the drive there. I kept reminding myself not to arrive guarded, not to armor up for a fight that hadn't happened yet, because I didn't want to be the kind of person who assumes the worst before giving the best of herself. Still, that small tightness in my chest followed me, that feeling you get when you're walking into a room where you already know you won't fully belong, and I wondered when exactly that shift had happened, when being someone's mother slowly turned into being an afterthought. It hadn't been sudden, not a single moment I could point to and say that's when it changed. It had happened quietly, through a series of polite exclusions, unanswered invitations, conversations that didn't quite pause long enough for me to step into them. I told myself it was normal, that children grow up, that lives get busy, sigh, but deep down I knew this wasn't distance, it was designed. From the moment I sat down at that table, I could feel it, that subtle separation, the way my daughter-in-law's attention skimmed past me rather than settling, the way she smiled without warmth, the way she spoke as if everything had already been decided somewhere I wasn't included. She's polished, efficient, always moving like she's managing something invisible, and for a long time I'd tried to meet her where she was, bringing flowers she left in their paper sleeves, offering help she declined with quick, tight smiles, suggesting afternoons together that never quite made it onto her calendar. I'd told myself she was busy, that she needed time, that not everyone shows affection the same way. Ha ha ha, funny how patient we can be with people who give us just enough hope to keep waiting. That night, as she ordered without looking at the menu prices, adding small plates, extras, a bottle of wine no one else discussed, I noticed how my son watched her more than he watched me, how his responses came after her glances, not before. And something in me softened and sank at the same time. I didn't blame him, not exactly. I'd raised him to be considerate, to keep the peace, to smooth things over, and now I was watching those lessons turned outward, away from me. I ordered my soup quietly, because it was what I wanted, and because I wasn't interested in competing for space at a table where the rules had already been set. When the food arrived, they leaned toward each other, sharing comments, laughing softly, and I found myself smiling along, nodding at the right times. Ha ha ha, the way you do when you're present in body but absent in every way that counts. I tried to join in once or twice, offering a comment, a memory, something light, but the conversation rolled on without adjusting its pace. And I felt that familiar sting of being talked around rather than talked to. It wasn't cruel, not openly, and that's what made it harder to name. There was no single moment I could point to and say this is wrong, only a growing sense that I was sitting at a table where my role was ornamental, not essential. My daughter-in-law checked her phone between courses, her face lighting up for messages that clearly weren't from either of us, and my son watched her with a look I used to recognize from his childhood, that look of wanting approval, of waiting for the next cue. I wondered quietly when he'd stopped looking at me that way. As the meal went on, that pressure in my chest returned, not sharp, just heavy, like something pressing down gently but insistently, and I realized I needed a moment away from the table, a small pause to collect myself before I said or did something that might reveal how exposed I felt. I didn't want to cry there, didn't want to sit through the rest of the evening with that tight smile glued to my face, so I excused myself calmly, pushing my chair back with care, murmuring that I'd be right back. Walking toward the restroom, I told myself I was being sensitive, that I was reading too much into ordinary behavior. Sigh, because admitting the truth that I felt unwelcome, felt heavier than pretending everything was fine. Inside the restroom, the air was cooler, quieter, and as I washed my hands, I looked at my reflection again, noticing how composed I still appeared, how none of the confusion or hurt showed on my face, and I thought, at least I can still hold myself together. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and prepared to walk back out, fully expecting to return to the same uncomfortable but manageable scene, to finish my soup, to make polite conversation, to go home and tell myself it hadn't been that bad. I had no idea that the table I was walking back toward would no longer be occupied, that the chairs would already be pushed back, that my quiet exit had given them the exact opening they needed to do what they'd clearly planned all along. And before you assume this was a misunderstanding or bad timing, let me ask you this. Have you ever stepped away for just a minute, trusting that people would wait for you, only to realize they'd been waiting for you to leave? Because what I saw when I returned wasn't accidental, and once you hear it, you'll understand why I stopped trying to explain my worth to anyone that night. When I stepped back into the dining room, I knew something was wrong before my eyes fully caught up, because silence has a sound to it, and this one hit me like a soft wall I hadn't been expecting, the kind that makes your stomach drop before your mind can explain why. The table was there, exactly where I'd left it, but everything else was off, like a photograph that had been disturbed, the chairs pushed back at odd angles, one napkin crumpled beside an empty glass, the wine flutes half finished, and my place still perfectly set, my bowl of soup untouched and cooling as if time had paused only for me. For a moment I just stood there, blinking, thinking maybe they'd stepped outside, maybe they were talking to someone, maybe this was some small confusion that would resolve itself if I waited long enough, ha ha ha. Isn't that what we do when the truth feels too sharp to touch right away? I looked around slowly, taking in the room, and that's when I noticed the eyes, the way people had gone quiet just enough to watch without looking like they were watching, the couple at the next table frozen mid-bite, the hostess glancing up and then quickly away, the waiter lingering near the bar with that hesitant posture of someone who knows something has gone wrong but isn't sure whose problem it is yet. I felt it then, that strange awareness of being visible in the worst possible way, not celebrated, not supported, just observed, like a moment people would whisper about later. Someone murmured, "She's still here," and it brushed past me like a cold draft, light but cutting, and for a second I wondered if I should pretend nothing was wrong, sit down and wait, but something inside me steadied instead. That's when I saw it, the napkin folded neatly in thirds at the edge of the table, placed too carefully to be an accident, resting beneath a fork as if it had been positioned for maximum effect. I stared at it for a few seconds longer than necessary, my hand hovering just above the table, and I remember thinking, don't rush this, because whatever was written there had been meant for me to find, not to stumble upon. When I finally picked it up, the fabric felt heavier than it should have, like it was carrying more than just words, and as I unfolded it, the message stared back at me, casual and cruel all at once, written in a slanted hand that didn't bother pretending to be kind. "Enjoy dinner, lovebirds, see," that was it. No explanation, no apology, just a joke folded into linen, and I felt my throat tighten, not enough to cry, not yet, but enough to make breathing feel deliberate, measured. I didn't read it again. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse because I didn't want anyone else to see it, and because part of me already understood that this note wasn't just for embarrassment, it was a test, a quiet dare to see what I would do next. My fingers were steady as I looked up, meeting the waiter's uncertain gaze as he finally stepped forward, holding a slim leather folder against his chest like a shield. He cleared his throat gently before speaking, his voice lowered in that practiced way people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Ma'am," he said, "your party informed us you'd be covering the bill." There it was, said plainly, without drama, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to wait with me. I nodded once, because nodding felt easier than speaking, and I said, "Of course," in a voice that surprised even me with how calm it sounded, "Ha ha ha, funny how composure shows up when you least expect it." He placed the folder on the table and stepped back, giving me space that felt both kind and isolating, and when I opened it, the number sat there in clean black ink, $790, itemized and unapologetic. One appetizer I'd ordered, 6 small plates I hadn't, the ribeye, the seafood tower, 2 cocktails, and that bottle of wine, $148 on its own, that I suddenly remembered my daughter-in-law smiling a little too much when she'd ordered. My hands still didn't shake, not then, because something in me had gone very still. The waiter asked if I'd like him to process it now, and I shook my head gently, looking up at him for the first time since he'd approached. "Not yet," I said, and after a small pause I added, "Could you do me a favor?" He blinked, surprised, and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." I adjusted the sleeve of my blouse, smoothing it down the way I always do when I'm trying to think clearly, and said, "Could you ask the manager to come by? Just tell him Evelyn Dree is here." I watched his expression change, just slightly, not panic, not fear, but recognition, and without another word, he turned and disappeared toward the kitchen. I stayed where I was. Seated at that half-empty table, the candle in front of me flickering steadily, my untouched soup cooling beside me, the note resting in my purse like a quiet weight, and for the first time that evening, I didn't feel small. I didn't cry, didn't chase after them, didn't reach for my phone to explain or defend myself, because I knew this moment wasn't about reacting, it was about choosing. People often think strength looks like confrontation, raised voices, slammed doors, but sometimes it looks like staying exactly where you are and letting the room feel the absence of the ones who left. As I waited, memories surfaced uninvited. Small flashes of a life spent showing up, packing lunches, working long days, folding laundry late into the night, and I realized how familiar this feeling was. The quiet after someone walks away, expecting you to clean up what they left behind. Only this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't rushing to make it easier for anyone else. This time, I was letting the moment stretch, letting the silence do its work, because I knew whoever came out of that kitchen next would change the direction of this evening entirely. And before I tell you who that was, and why hearing my own name spoken in that room shifted everything, ask yourself this. If someone embarrassed you on purpose, if they left you holding the cost of their choices, would you rush to cover it quietly? Or would you finally sit still long enough to let the truth catch up to them? The thing about numbers is that they're honest in a way people rarely are, and as I sat there staring at that bill, I realized the amount itself wasn't what made my chest feel tight, it was the intention behind every single line printed on that page. $790 doesn't sneak up on you by accident. It arrives with confidence, with choices made loudly and without hesitation, and as my eyes moved slowly down the list, I could almost replay the evening in reverse, each item attached to a moment I'd already felt but hadn't fully understood yet. There was the seafood tower they'd leaned over together, the ribeye my son hadn't even looked up from when it arrived, the 2 cocktails I hadn't touched, and then that wine, the one my daughter-in-law ordered with that smile, the one she didn't ask anyone about, the one that sat there like a symbol of something bigger than taste. $148 for a bottle meant to be enjoyed, paid for by someone they clearly didn't think deserved to be asked. I closed the folder gently because slamming it would have drawn attention, and attention wasn't what I wanted, not yet. The waiter hovered nearby, doing that polite half-step people take when they don't know whether to intrude or retreat, and I could see the question on his face before he asked it, the unspoken "Are you okay?" And when he finally spoke, it was careful, respectful. "Would you like me to run this now?" he asked, and for just a second I considered saying yes, handing over my card, ending the scene before it had a chance to grow roots. That's what I'd always done before, smoothed things over, paid the quiet cost, gone home and swallowed whatever was left unsaid. But something inside me shifted then, not angrily, not dramatically, just firmly, like a door closing without a sound. "No," I said softly, "not yet." And the look of relief on his face told me he understood more than he let on. I asked him for a favor, keeping my voice even, my posture relaxed, and when I said my name, I felt the smallest flicker of power return to my spine, not because I was important, but because I was present. He nodded, disappeared toward the kitchen, and I was left alone again with the candle, the bill, and the hum of the restaurant slowly returning to normal around me. Conversations resumed, forks clinked, laughter bubbled up at nearby tables, and it struck me how quickly the world moves on from moments that feel enormous when you're inside them. I watched the flame in front of me dance slightly, steady despite the air currents, and I thought, be like that, steady even when everything else shifts. As I waited, I thought about all the other times I'd been handed something I hadn't ordered, emotionally or otherwise, and expected to pay without question. The school fees I covered when my son's father disappeared, the extra shifts I picked up without complaint, the favors I did because it was easier than explaining why I was tired. This bill wasn't new, it was just printed more clearly. I reached into my purse and touched the folded napkin without pulling it out, feeling the edge of the fabric under my fingers, and I almost laughed, because even now, they thought the joke was on me, that the humiliation was the point. They didn't realize the joke only works if the person on the receiving end plays along. When the waiter returned, he didn't come alone. He was followed by the manager, a man with a calm face and an attentive posture, the kind of person who's learned to read rooms for a living. He stopped a few feet from the table, his eyes flicking briefly to the empty chairs, the untouched soup, the closed folder, and then back to me. "Good evening," he said. "I'm the manager." "Is everything all right?" His tone was neutral, professional, but curious, and I could tell he was already piecing things together. I smiled politely because politeness costs nothing and said, "Mostly yes." I slid the leather folder toward him without opening it again, and then, after a small pause, I reached into my purse and placed the folded napkin beside it on the table. He didn't touch either right away. Instead, he looked at me, really looked, as if trying to decide what kind of situation this was, and I could almost see the calculation happening behind his eyes. When he finally unfolded the napkin and read the note, his jaw tightened just enough to give him away, and when he glanced at the bill, something shifted in his posture from routine to concern. "I'm sorry this happened," he said quietly. "If you'd like, we can remove." I shook my head gently, cutting him off before he finished. "No," I said. "I'll be paying." That surprised him, I could tell, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath again. "I didn't order most of this," I continued evenly, "but I will pay it." He hesitated, clearly torn between policy and instinct, and I could see he wanted to make it right, to fix it quickly, but this wasn't about fixing the bill, it was about owning the moment. "All right," he said finally, nodding once, "if that's what you want." He stepped back slightly, giving me space, and I realized then that paying wasn't surrender, it was choice. I wasn't being trapped anymore. I was deciding how this story would move forward. As I took my card out, my hand paused just long enough for me to feel the weight of it, not the plastic, but what it represented. This wasn't about money. It was about dignity, about refusing to let someone else define the terms of my worth. I slid the card into the folder and handed it back without ceremony, and when the waiter returned to process the payment, I kept my eyes on the candle, on that steady flame, breathing slowly, deliberately. When the receipt came back, I signed it with the same careful handwriting I'd used for decades, not rushed, not angry, just complete. The manager lingered nearby, and before he walked away, he said something that stayed with me. "Most people wouldn't handle this the way you did," he said quietly, not as a compliment, but as an observation. I looked up at him then and smiled, a real one this time, and replied, "Most people weren't raised the way I was." He nodded, understanding flickering across his face, and left me there, alone again but no longer exposed. I sat for a moment longer after that, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the end of something settle fully before standing up. I tucked the receipt into my purse next to the napkin, two small pieces of paper that held more truth than the entire evening's conversation, and as I reached for my coat, I felt a strange calm wash over me, the kind that comes when you stop waiting for permission to respect yourself. But what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was that paying that bill wasn't the end of the story at all. It was the beginning of something much quieter, much sharper, and far more unforgettable. Just when I thought the evening had finally finished taking from me, when I believed I could stand up, walk out, and let this become another quiet story I folded away for later, something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, the way it does when a room senses a change before the mind catches up. The manager didn't leave immediately after the payment went through. Instead, he paused near the kitchen doors, glanced back at me once more, and then stepped aside as someone else emerged from the back, someone whose presence didn't announce itself loudly but still managed to draw attention without asking for it. She walked with an ease that comes from knowing exactly where you belong, her posture relaxed, her expression already softening as her eyes found mine, and before she even reached the table, I felt that old, familiar click of recognition settle into place. Ha ha ha, life has a funny way of circling back when you least expect it. She stopped a few steps away and smiled, not the polite smile reserved for guests, but a genuine one that reached her eyes, and when she spoke my name, she said it like it mattered. "Evelyn," she said, her voice warm with surprise, "I wasn't told you were here." I stood instinctively because respect goes both ways and replied, "Hello, Juliet." It's been a while. Hearing her name in that room felt surreal for a moment, like two separate parts of my life briefly overlapping, and I saw the manager's eyes widen just slightly behind her, realization dawning in real time. Juliet Reyes wasn't just another staff member. She was someone who oversaw the entire group of restaurants, a woman I'd known for years through quiet, ordinary connections no one ever thinks to ask about. She took my hands briefly, squeezing once, her concern immediate and unfiltered. "Is everything all right?" she asked, already scanning the empty chairs, the untouched soup, the closed folder on the table. "Yes," I said, and then added honestly, "mostly." The manager hovered uncertainly, but one look from Juliet was enough to send him stepping back, giving us privacy without question. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat, her attention focused entirely on me, and for the first time that evening, I didn't feel like I was taking up space I hadn't earned. "They told me you were dining with family," she said carefully, her tone neutral but probing. "I was," I replied, keeping my voice steady, for most of the evening. I slid the leather folder toward her, then reached into my purse and placed the folded napkin beside it, the fabric whispering softly against the tablecloth as it landed. Juliet opened the folder first, her eyes moving quickly over the bill, and I watched her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Then she unfolded the napkin and read the note, and whatever composure she'd been holding shifted into something sharper, something protective. "I'm so sorry," she said, looking up at me, anger flickering beneath the calm. "This shouldn't have happened. I can have this taken care of immediately." I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "I've already paid." She stared at me for a moment, surprised, then leaned back slightly, studying my face as if trying to understand the choice. "They ordered it," she said, still clearly bothered. "I know," I replied evenly. "That's why I paid. I wanted it to be my decision." Juliet exhaled slowly, nodding once as something like respect crossed her features. "All right," she said. "If that's what you want." She stood briefly to speak quietly to the manager, her voice low, controlled, and when she returned she didn't rush away as if she sensed there was more to be said. "You know," she said softly, resting her fingertips on the table, "most people would have handled this very differently." I smiled faintly. Most people, I replied, haven't spent a lifetime learning when to stay and when to stand. She gave a small, appreciative laugh at that, not amused, just understanding, and then her expression shifted, becoming more serious. There's something else you should know, she said. Off the record. I nodded, already sensing where this was going. She explained then, simply without drama, that the restaurant was part of a private group, several venues across the city that shared standards not just about food or service, but about how people were treated within their walls. When there's a pattern, she said carefully, when someone crosses a line in how they treat others, we make a note of it. It's not public, but it's shared, a way of protecting our staff and our guests. She paused, watching my face closely. We don't use it often. I listened quietly, my hands folded neatly in front of me, feeling a calm clarity settle in. This wasn't gossip, it was policy, and more importantly, it was choice. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small tablet, holding it but not turning it on yet. I don't want to assume anything, she continued, but if you want, I can make sure your son and his wife aren't welcomed back into any of our locations. The words landed softly but firmly between us, and for a moment I said nothing, letting the weight of them sink in. I thought about the way my daughter-in-law had laughed when she ordered that wine, about my son's silence as I was left behind, about the napkin folded so neatly it might as well have been rehearsed. I felt no surge of anger, no rush of satisfaction, just a simple, steady sense of right and wrong aligning. Yes, I said finally, meeting her eyes, but don't tell them I asked. Juliet nodded without hesitation, no smile this time, just respect. I'll handle it, she said, tucking the tablet back into her bag. She stood, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and squeezed once before walking away, leaving me alone again at the table. I sat there for a moment longer, not basking, not replaying the scene, just breathing, letting the evening settle into something solid and chosen. As I picked up my coat and stood to leave, I realized this night hadn't taken something from me after all. It had returned something I didn't realize I'd been missing. And just when I thought the story would end there, quietly and without witnesses, the first message arrived 2 days later, and that's when I understood that silence, when chosen carefully, can echo louder than any confrontation ever could. By the time I walked out of that restaurant, the night air felt cooler than it had when I arrived, or maybe it was just me, finally breathing without that weight pressing on my chest. And as I made my way home, I kept thinking about something Juliet had said without actually saying it out loud, that paying the bill wasn't weakness, it was authorship. I hadn't been forced into anything in the end. I'd chosen how the evening would close, and there's a quiet kind of strength in that, the kind that doesn't need witnesses or applause. When I got home, I set my purse down, took off my shoes, and stood there in the hallway for a long moment, staring at nothing, letting the silence wrap around me. Sigh, because after years of noise, you don't realize how loud quiet can feel. 2 days passed before the first message came through, and I remember exactly where I was when my phone buzzed, standing at the kitchen counter. Peeling apples for a pie, I wasn't even sure anyone would come over to eat. I wiped my hands on a towel before picking up the phone, half expecting an apology or at least an awkward explanation, something that would let me believe the note had been a misunderstanding. Instead, the screen lit up with a message from my daughter-in-law that made my lips part in disbelief, not anger, just a soft, incredulous O. She wrote that she hoped the soup had been worth it, followed by a little laughing emoji, and for a second I just stared at the screen, my thumb hovering, my chest tightening in a way that felt familiar and deeply tired. Ha ha ha, imagine that after everything that's what she chose to say. I didn't respond. I didn't type and delete, didn't craft a clever reply, didn't feel the need to explain myself, because explaining only works when the other person is listening. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the counter, letting the silence answer for me, and as I went back to my apples, I felt something loosen inside me, not because it felt good, but because it felt final. That evening my son sent his own message, shorter, clipped, almost rehearsed in its own way, telling me that next time I shouldn't order the steak if I couldn't afford it. I read it once, then again, not because it hurt more the second time, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. I wasn't. I set the phone down again, sigh, and went on with my evening. Life didn't stop after that, which might be the strangest part of all. I still went grocery shopping on Wednesday, still attended garden club on Thursday, still folded laundry and made tea, and watched the sun slide slowly across my living room floor. The days moved in their small, steady circles, and in that normalcy I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. I wasn't waiting for the next message, wasn't bracing for confrontation, wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head anymore. The silence I'd chosen was holding, and for the first time in a long while it felt like it was working in my favor. By Friday morning, things began to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but quietly, through other people, through second-hand comments and half-told stories. My neighbor's daughter, Lisa, who worked front of house at one of the newer places downtown, mentioned to her mother that a woman had been turned away from brunch after arguing loudly with staff about a reservation that didn't exist. The description was vague, but I recognized it immediately: the insistence, the disbelief, the entitlement dressed up as confusion. I listened politely as my neighbor relayed the story while dropping off lemon muffins, nodding, smiling, saying nothing, ha ha ha, because some things don't need confirmation to be understood. Later that same day, my son tried to book a table for their anniversary, the restaurant his wife had circled months earlier, the one she'd called her dream spot. The reservation was declined. Again, I didn't hear it from him. I heard it through the same quiet network of everyday conversations that had always carried the truth more reliably than direct communication ever did. That evening, Juliet sent me a short message, just 2 words: they noticed. I stared at it for a long moment before replying with a simple thank you, and even as I hit send, I felt no rush of satisfaction, no urge to gloat. That had never been the point, and if this story is resonating with you, if you've ever been made to feel small by people who should have known better, consider staying with this channel, because stories like this aren't about revenge, they're about boundaries, and sometimes hearing them reminds us that we're allowed to have our own. I didn't need a front row seat to their frustration, didn't need updates or apologies or explanations, because I wasn't trying to win anything. I was just reclaiming space I'd given away too easily for too long. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, her voice controlled but tight, asking if we could have dinner to clear the air, suggesting the same restaurant like nothing had happened at all. I paused before answering, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make my point, then agreed, marking the time in my planner like any other appointment. I didn't feel nervous or hopeful, just curious, because I already knew something they didn't: that when you change the rules quietly, the outcome changes too. And before I tell you what happened when we met again, ask yourself this. When someone finally feels the weight of the line they crossed, do they reach out to apologize, or do they reach out to regain control? Because the difference matters more than most people realize. The days leading up to that second dinner passed more calmly than I expected, not with anticipation or dread, but with a steady sort of clarity that surprised me every time I noticed it, like realizing you've been holding your breath for years and only just started breathing normally again. I went about my routines without rushing, without checking my phone every few minutes, without rehearsing conversations in my head, and in those ordinary moments, watering plants, folding towels, standing in line at the pharmacy, I understood something important. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast and loud, but what I felt was cooler, quieter, and far more durable. It was the feeling of knowing exactly where you stand. When Friday arrived, I got ready the same way I always do: no extra effort, no dramatic choices, just clean clothes, steady hands, and a small nod to my reflection that said, "You don't need to prove anything tonight." I arrived a few minutes early, as I prefer to do, and the host greeted me by name, not loudly, not performatively, just naturally, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He led me to a small table near the window, and as I sat down, smoothing my jacket and resting my hands in my lap, I felt that same calm settle in again, the one that comes when you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I ordered water and waited, watching the light outside soften as evening edged, and at 5 minutes past the hour, they walked through the door together, my son in a charcoal blazer, my daughter-in-law in a pale dress she'd worn before, earrings I recognized from an old birthday photo, both of them looking precisely how they liked to look: put together, confident, important. I watched from my seat as they approached the host's stand, smiling, speaking, handing over a name with the expectation that the rest would follow automatically. The host's smile didn't fade, but it did pause, and I saw him glance at the screen, then check again, his posture shifting ever so slightly. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and said something quietly that made my daughter-in-law's expression flicker. "I'm sorry," he said gently, his voice calm but firm. "But you're not permitted to dine here." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unmistakable, and for a moment no one moved. My daughter-in-law blinked, clearly certain she'd misheard. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp with disbelief. "Your names are on our restricted list," the host continued, still polite, still composed. "I'll have to ask you to leave the premises." My son stepped forward immediately, his voice tight but controlled, insisting there must be a mistake, that they were invited, that they had a reservation. The manager appeared then, as if summoned by the shift in energy, his presence steady and unmistakable. "There's no mistake," he said evenly. "We maintain standards across all our venues." Unfortunately, those standards were not upheld. I didn't move, I didn't look away, I didn't need to. My daughter-in-law's gaze found me almost immediately, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing into a thin line as realization dawned. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice rising despite herself. I took a slow sip of water before answering, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel deliberate. "You made the reservation," I said calmly. "I just showed up." My son's jaw tightened as he turned toward me, frustration etched across his face. "Mom, this is too much," he said. "Whatever you're trying to prove, it's gone far enough." I met his eyes then, really met them, and felt no urge to defend myself. "I'm not trying to prove anything," I replied. "I just matched the distance you walked away from me." They were asked again, firmly this time, to leave, and after a moment of tense hesitation, they turned and walked out, the doors closing softly behind them, cutting off the noise of the street outside. I watched the entire thing without triumph, without satisfaction, just with a quiet acceptance that this was the natural end of a choice they'd made earlier. When the manager returned his attention to me, he asked if I was all right, and I nodded, thanking him before finishing my water and standing to leave. The evening hadn't gone the way any of us had planned, but it had gone exactly the way it needed to outside. They caught up to me near the entrance, my daughter-in-law moving first, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her voice already edged with accusation. She asked again if this was my doing, if this was some kind of punishment, and I stopped, turning to face her under the glow of the streetlight. "No," I said evenly, "it's a boundary." My son stepped between us, his hands lifted in that familiar gesture meant to calm things down, telling me I didn't have to do it like this, that I could have talked to them. I looked at him, at the man he'd become, and felt a sadness that had nothing to do with guilt. "I tried," I said quietly. "You just weren't listening." For a moment, none of us spoke. Cars passed, laughter drifted from another restaurant down the block, and life continued on without pause, indifferent to the small collapse unfolding on the sidewalk. Then I stepped around them and began walking home, not out of anger, not in defeat, but with the certainty that comes when you stop carrying what was never yours to hold. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. A week later, there was a knock on my door just after lunch, unexpected and unannounced, and when I opened it, I saw my son standing there alone, hands in his pockets, something heavy in his eyes. And before I tell you what he said and what I didn't, ask yourself this. When someone finally realizes they've lost access to you, do they come back with humility, or with the hope that time will erase what they refuse to face? The week after that evening felt different in a way I can only describe as lighter, not because nothing hurt anymore, but because I wasn't carrying confusion with me everywhere I went. Confusion is exhausting. It asks questions that never get answered. Clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, lets you rest. When my son knocked on my door that Thursday afternoon, I didn't rush to open it, not out of spite, but because I was finishing what I was doing, wiping down the kitchen counter, setting my sponge neatly by the sink, taking one steady breath before turning the handle. When I saw him standing there alone, no polished smile, no rehearsed confidence, just him, my first instinct wasn't anger or relief, it was recognition. This was the version of him I remembered, the one who used to show up without a script. I stepped aside and let him in without a word. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd once done homework, elbows resting awkwardly on the surface, hands clasped and unclasped as if he didn't quite know what to do with them. I poured tea the way I always had, 2 cups, the familiar routine grounding both of us, sigh, because habits like that carry history in them. He didn't touch his cup. He stared at it for a long moment before finally speaking, saying his wife was still upset, that she felt humiliated, that she didn't understand why things had gone so far. I listened quietly, stirring my tea once, then setting the spoon down carefully, waiting until he finished. "Are you?" I asked, not accusing, not challenging, just curious. He hesitated, his shoulders dropping slightly as if the question had caught him off guard. He said he didn't know, that he felt caught in the middle, that it wasn't supposed to turn into something this big. I nodded slowly because I believed him and because intention doesn't always cancel impact. "You left me at a table," I said softly. I chose not to follow. He looked down at his hands then, jaw tightening, and said it was meant to be funny, just a joke that went wrong. I didn't argue with him, I didn't raise my voice or list every reason that explanation fell apart. "No," I replied calmly, "it was meant to see what I'd tolerate." He didn't apologize, not directly, and I didn't ask him to. I also didn't explain everything I could have, didn't tell him about Juliet or the network or the quiet decisions made without shouting. I didn't tell him about the messages I'd read and locked away without answering, or how many times over the years I'd chosen silence because it felt easier than insisting on respect. Some lessons don't land when they're explained, they land when they're felt. He stayed for maybe 20 minutes, talking in circles, searching for something to make the situation smaller again, and when he stood to leave, I walked him to the door. There was no hug, no coldness either, just an honest space between us that hadn't existed before. After he left, I went back to the kitchen and opened the drawer where I keep important papers, tax returns, insurance forms, things I don't revisit often but know exactly where to find. I took out the folded receipt from the restaurant, smoothed it once, and slid it neatly between the folders. Not as evidence, not as a trophy, but as a marker, a reminder of the moment I stopped paying emotional debts that were never mine. Ha ha ha, funny how a piece of paper can carry so much weight without making a sound. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes, subtle ones that only show up when you're paying attention. The phone stayed quieter. The tension I'd grown used to bracing against wasn't there anymore. I laughed more easily at garden club, slept more deeply at night, and found myself humming while folding laundry, all little signs that something inside me had finally unclenched. I didn't feel victorious and I didn't feel guilty either. I felt settled. And that, I realized, was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. People often think closure comes with a conversation, an apology, a neat ending where everyone agrees on what happened. But sometimes closure looks like this instead, a quiet understanding that you don't need anyone's permission to step out of a role that hurts you. I didn't know what would happen next, whether things would ever smooth over or remain distant, and for once, I didn't feel the need to control the outcome. I'd already chosen myself, and that choice didn't require constant reinforcement. Still, as calm as those days were, life has a way of circling back one more time, just to test whether you really mean what you've decided. And when the next message arrived, unexpected, carefully worded, and asking for something I'd once given without hesitation, I realized this story wasn't quite finished teaching its lesson yet. The message came late in the evening, polite on the surface, carefully written in that way people use when they want something but don't want to admit it, and as I read it, I felt no spike of emotion at all, just a quiet awareness that this was the moment where old patterns usually tried to slip back in. It asked if we could talk again, really talk this time, if we could put things behind us and move forward like adults, and I noticed how it skipped over words like sorry and responsibility, how it focused instead on comfort, on restoring balance without acknowledging what had tipped it in the first place. I set my phone down and stared out the window for a while, watching the reflection of the room in the glass, sighed because saying no used to feel like something I had to justify, and now it felt like something I was allowed to choose. I didn't reply right away. Not because I was punishing anyone, but because I wanted to answer from a place that wasn't reactive. When I finally did respond, it was brief and calm, agreeing to meet, suggesting a simple coffee instead of dinner, neutral ground, nothing ceremonial. The reply came quickly, redirecting the plan back toward a restaurant, a familiar one framed as an olive branch, as if sharing a table again would somehow reset everything. I almost laughed, ha, because some people really do believe that repeating a setting can rewrite the outcome. After a moment, I agreed, not because I expected an apology, but because I was curious to see whether anything had actually changed. The evening arrived without fanfare. I showed up a few minutes early, as usual, and waited outside for a moment before going in, feeling the cool air on my face, grounding myself in the present. When they arrived, they looked different to me, not because they'd changed, but because I had. My daughter-in-law's smile was controlled, careful, and my son's eyes searched my face like he was trying to read a language he'd forgotten. We sat, ordered simply this time, and for a few minutes conversation stayed safely shallow work updates, whether the kind of talk that fills space without touching anything important eventually. My daughter-in-law cleared her throat and said she felt things had gotten out of hand, that everyone had misunderstood everyone else, and that maybe we should all just agree to let it go. She spoke smoothly, confidently, as if she were offering a reasonable solution, and I realized she wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was asking for access. I listened without interrupting, nodding once to acknowledge I'd heard her, and when she finished, I took a slow breath before speaking. I don't need to let it go, I said evenly. I've already put it down. The words landed more heavily than I'd intended, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable to me anymore. My son jumped in then, saying he didn't want things to stay strained, that he missed how things used to be, that he just wanted peace. I looked at him and felt a familiar tug in my chest, not pain but memory, and I spoke gently because he was still my son. Peace isn't pretending something didn't hurt, I said. Peace is knowing it won't happen again. My daughter-in-law's expression tightened, and she asked what exactly I wanted, her tone edged now, frustration peeking through the polish. I didn't hesitate. Respect, I said. And distance when that respect isn't possible. The conversation ended shortly after that, not with raised voices or slammed doors, but with the clear understanding that things were not going back to how they were. We paid our own checks, stood, and said polite goodbyes that felt final in a way none of us commented on. As I walked home, the streetlights glowing softly overhead, I felt something settle firmly into place, not sadness, not triumph, but acceptance. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping they'd become different people. I was simply done bending myself to fit spaces where I'd never been fully welcome. That night I slept deeply, without replaying conversations or imagining alternate endings, and when I woke the next morning, the world felt steady in a way it hadn't before. But life, just when you think it's finished testing you, likes to offer one last moment, one final chance to see if you'll revert to old habits, or stand quietly in the new ground you've claimed. And when that moment arrived, it came in the simplest form possible, asking almost nothing, yet demanding everything I'd just learned to protect. The last test didn't arrive with drama or confrontation. It came quietly, almost politely, the way old habits tend to knock when they're hoping you won't recognize them for what they are. It was a short message asking if I could help with something small, something practical, framed as temporary, harmless, the kind of request I used to say yes to before the sentence even finished forming. I read it once, then again, and felt that familiar pull, the reflex to smooth things over, to prove I was still useful, still generous, still willing. I set the phone down and laughed softly to myself, ha ha ha, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. The situation had changed, but the expectation hadn't. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I went about my morning, made tea, opened the curtains, let sunlight spill across the floor, and in that ordinary routine, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Boundaries aren't loud, they don't announce themselves, they don't require speeches or explanations. They simply exist, steady and unmoving, and the people who benefit from your lack of them will always be the first to notice when they're finally there. When I did respond, it was brief and kind but firm. I said I couldn't help with that and I wished them well. No reasons, no apologies, just truth. After that, there was silence, and this time it felt complete, not tense. Not unfinished, just quiet. I went back to my life, to the rhythms that had always been there waiting for me to fully return to them. I spent more time in my garden, hands in the soil, watching things grow at their own pace. I lingered over books instead of rushing through pages. I laughed with friends without checking my phone every few minutes, all because I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. I was present, and that presence felt like a gift I'd finally allowed myself to open one afternoon. While organizing papers in my desk, I came across the receipt again, the one I'd tucked away so carefully, and I unfolded it slowly, tracing the numbers with my eyes. $790. A small fortune for one dinner, a ridiculous amount for a lesson I never wanted, and yet, as I held it there, I realized I didn't regret paying it. That receipt wasn't a symbol of being taken advantage of anymore. It was proof of the moment I stopped negotiating my dignity. I folded it once more and placed it back where it belonged, not hidden, not displayed, just kept, like you keep something that mattered because it marked a turning point. People talk a lot about forgiveness, about letting go, about being the bigger person, but they rarely talk about the cost of staying small to keep others comfortable. I didn't stop loving my son, I didn't turn into someone cold or bitter. I simply stepped out of a pattern that had quietly taught others how to treat me. And here's the thing no one tells you. When you stop over-explaining, when you stop fixing what you didn't break, when you stop chasing understanding from people who benefit from misunderstanding you, the world doesn't fall apart. It adjusts. Weeks passed, then months, and the sharp edges of the situation softened into something manageable, something that no longer occupied my thoughts every day. There were moments of sadness, of course, moments when I missed what I'd hoped for rather than what I'd had, sigh, because letting go of expectations can hurt more than letting go of people. But there was also pride, quiet and steady, in knowing I hadn't betrayed myself to keep the peace. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't embarrassed anyone publicly, I hadn't demanded apologies or explanations. I'd simply changed my position. Sometimes I think back to that table, to the empty chairs, the untouched soup, the napkin folded so neatly it felt rehearsed, and I wonder what they expected me to do. Cry, chase them down. Pay and apologize for being there in the first place. Maybe what they didn't expect was stillness. They didn't expect me to stay seated, to pay calmly, to walk out with my head up and my choices intact. They didn't expect me to remember who I was without needing their approval to confirm it. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been put in a position where kindness was mistaken for permission, where silence was mistaken for agreement, I hope you take something from it, not a desire for revenge, but a reminder that you're allowed to decide how people treat you, even when those people are family. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength and choosing yourself without shouting, consider subscribing. Sometimes we just need to know we're not alone in learning these lessons. I still go out to dinner now and then. I still enjoy good food, good company, a well-set table, but I choose carefully who I share those moments with, because time, like respect, is something you give intentionally. And every so often when I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, I smile, not because everything turned out perfectly, but because I finally did something I'd been putting off for far too long. I stopped paying for other people's choices, and I started living comfortably within my own.